Welcome back to World Building Praxis, where we are building a world from scratch for use as a D&D campaign setting. Last time, we talked about what our maps say about our setting, and used what we learned to divide our continent into regions. In this episode, we are going to deepen our understanding of those regions by designing a capital city for each. Then, we're going to spend some time thinking about how those capitals interact with each other, deepening our setting's regional and political complexity. Since Praxis is a politically devolved setting, its capital cities are not going to be analogous to those of Earth. The regions we defined in the last video are not states or nations, they are simply how the people of the continent see the world. Our capital cities are centers of a great deal of political power, but their respective sovereignties are not going to span entire regions. We'll be using quite a few tables in this episode, so I'll reiterate something I've said before. If at any point in time you don't love what you've rolled and want to re-roll, or you just have a better idea, do it. Every time. You aren't breaking any rules if you do so. The tables are there to kick your imagination into gear, not to hold you back. Second caveat, this is my collection of tables. When I was starting out in my DM journey, I copied down a ton of tables from the DMG simply to become more comfortable with them. Through the years, I would come across situations where one of them wasn't really meeting my needs or fitting my setting as a whole, so I would modify it. Sometimes to the point of it being unrecognizable. And, of course, I came across many situations where I wanted to roll something on a table, but the table didn't exist, so I had to make my own. What I'm trying to say is that these notebooks, and by extension my videos, contain a hodgepodge of tables copied directly from the DMG, tables originally from the DMG that have been heavily modified, and original tables of my own design. During this video, I will do my best to label where every table came from, but it's possible something falls through the cracks. These are the tables I usually use to roll settlement size, but we're rolling capital cities. If your setting is more or less politically evolved than Praxis, feel free to massage these values. You can choose to use an online population density calculator if you want, but I rarely do. On one hand, in a setting with medium or higher magic level, these numbers all kind of go out the window, and on the other hand, numbers this granular really don't interest me much, so I tend not to spend much time on them. For a point of reference, Cordoba was one of the most populous cities on Earth in the 11th century. Its population at this time is estimated to be around 400,000, but some historians think it could have been as high as 1 million. Once again, feel free to tweak these numbers to make them more in line with your setting. For this next roll, we're going to lean on the timeline we designed when we wrote our setting's history. We divided Praxis into 3 eras, so we'll roll a d8 with a bias towards the more recent. Next, we need to know why the city was founded in the first place. This roll is also going to give us a clue about where in our region it will be located. For example, our first capital was founded for its military defensibility, so we'll keep that in mind when placing it on our map. We're also going to keep in mind the historical map we made a few steps ago, and let it influence our capital's locations. How exactly you do this is going to depend on your setting, its history, and when the city was founded. For our capital city to function as such, it must have a government. The DMG gives us a nice weighted table to roll on, but in my opinion, an 80-person village shouldn't be rolled on the same table as a regional capital. So here are my modified versions of it, catered to settlements of different sizes. Next, we'll roll on a slightly modified version of the DMG's ruler status table. Not all forms of government are going to have a singular leader, but most will at least have an elder or council member who is some combination of the most senior, the most respected, or the most influential. We'll also need some qualities that make this particular city unique. So we'll roll on my adaptation of the DMG's notable traits and reputation tables. And finally, to give our capital some economic or strategic power, we'll roll it a resource. If you'd like, you can also roll on this table for a founding species. It is also totally fair for you to simply decide what species, singular or plural, makes the most sense as a founder. Keep in mind the history we wrote a few steps ago. In the case of Praxis, any cities founded in the First or Second Ages were almost certainly Elvish or Dwarvish, respectively. But in the setting's third and current era, I'm going to use this table. Note that when I roll an 18 to 20, I am then rolling on an online master list of every playable species in 5th edition. Also note that I am not letting the founding species have an outsized influence on the current demographics of the city. I'm mainly using it to have a mental picture of what the oldest architecture in the city is going to look like and what naming language to use for it. We'll then use this table and our naming languages to name our city. We'll use a similar process to the one explained in the Writing Your Settings History video. Now our city needs an injection of drama. The DMG has a table called Current Calamity, which you could roll on, but I always liked the idea of a settlement having two concurrent threats, one internal and one external. So I chopped it up, added some spice, and created these two new tables. The differentiation between internal and external threats gives our city a nice balance of encounters. The internal threat is likely going to require some social interactions, while the external threat is likely going to require some good old-fashioned combat. And from here, we'll take a look at our roles and see if they speak to us. Our first capital, called Trefton, is a relatively small monarchy, founded in the current era for its easily defensible position. Normally, with this particular role, I would be looking to place it on a peninsula or between some mountains, but this area's history is coming in handy. A few videos ago, we established that this region was once controlled by an elven empire, the Kiliad, which was known for its use of life-draining technology. Combine that with the fortresses built by a few of its splinter states, and you can probably see where I'm going with this. Our capital was founded around an abandoned First-era fortress and grew outwards from there. Moving on down the list of what we rolled, we can see that the city is home to a notable orchard and is known for its greed. Toss in the city's internal threat of a plague, and here's what I came up with. The impeccable quality of the apples from Trefton's orchard is unnatural. It sits directly over some of the Kiliad Empire's life-draining technology and is sapping energy from every living thing in the surrounding area. Trefton's monarch, one Alani Moonbringer, is merely a figurehead, under the thumb of a small cabal of influential aristocrats who are guarding this secret with every fiber of their authority, lest their very profitable status quo be threatened. The town's external threat, a monster nest, serves as both a distraction and disposal site for any adventurers who get too nosy. As a side note, the things we have designed for this city have turned on that little writer light bulb in my brain. One thing we should always be on the lookout for when designing adventures, or writing narrative for that matter, is the opportunity to provide setup for a later payoff. In this instance, I know that I want to introduce my players to that life-draining technology at a location that is not the capital we just designed, whether that happens to be the aforementioned monster nest or some other stop along the way. If they are introduced to and familiarized with this concept beforehand, it will make the uncovering of Trefton's dark secret that much more satisfying. I think I'll do a whole video on setup and payoff eventually. On another, more serious note, Trefton got a little more real than I expected it to. Metaphorical, for sure, but still pretty on the nose. As a quick disclaimer, alluding to real-world issues in your game deserves at least a little consideration. On one hand, being presented with an issue that they recognize can galvanize your players into action, or make them think a little bit harder about the actions they do take. On the other hand, if someone at your table has to constantly deal with a particular societal injustice in their real life, they may not want to continue to deal with it when they are playing a game set in a fantasy world that is supposed to be fun. My best advice is an echo of Matt Colville's. You know your players better than I do. Make sure you have a good deal of open communication with them, and use that communication to influence your game. In the case of my table, I am very confident that they would love adventuring in Trefton, seeing as they have a penchant for things like civil disobedience, inciting revolution, and lighting stuff on fire. We went pretty in-depth with Trefton, and that's because I know that the first 3 or 4 adventures I run in this setting will take place in this region. Going forward, we are going to be making the same roles for each of our other capital cities while going into a bit less detail. We are free to add things later on, but as I've said before, we want to get to the table as fast as possible. So we don't want to spend too much time on something that our players will never be within 1,000 miles of. Down south in the Marshwood, Archelia is a pluvial metropolis. Originally settled by a small halfling community for its nearby silver mine, it has since become a tropical trade hub. After the mutual destruction of the great human empires, the city's ensuing power vacuum was filled by the Glacewater clan, a monarchy which quickly turned into a dynasty. The Glacewaters knew that Archelia's future lay in more than silver. In their eyes, the area's most valuable resource was the arcane rainforest surrounding it. The magical trees of the Marshwood hold many secrets, at least a few of which they reasoned would prove useful. Over the next 5 generations, Archelia's understanding of the Marshwood blossomed. Advancements in alchemy and botany have led to the full-scale integration of the rainforest into Archelian society. Specially grown plant products give the city not only its food and medicine, but its transportation, water, information storage, machinery, and much more. The growth in its technology was mirrored by its population as well as its culture. Now a paragon of free thought and progress, Archelia's autocratic roots have almost been forgotten, as a variety of factions representing a spectrum of ideologies have begun to sprout up among the trees. The Glacewaters have largely adapted to these changes, but a recent report from one of their scouts has divided the nobility. The discovery of mind-influencing trees deep in the rainforest has given certain members of the royal family the vision of a reunited population, once again under the Glacewaters' absolute rule. Nestled in the southern Stavat Mountains, Herhadrom has stood the test of time. In the wake of the relentlessly expansionist Hevingvat Empire, this city was founded out of necessity. Herhadrom was originally an amalgamation of 3 separate tribes, looking to resist the military advances of their neighbors to the north. How a single settlement was able to repeatedly fend off an empire has long been a subject of debate, but most agree that it wouldn't have been able to without some supernatural help. The Hevingvat offensive's now ancient history, Herhadrom functions as a republic, widely known to be a bastion of freedom and independence, sporting a strong coalition of guilds, a booming economy, and a diverse population. Lately, though, there have been rumblings of unrest in the older parts of town. Disappearances, unexplained maladies, and sightings of undead. The guild leaders aren't overly concerned, happy to hire a few adventurers to clear out the skeletons, but those who know the city's history have begun to grow apprehensive. Some of them believe that whatever entity their ancestors made a deal with has come to collect. We haven't spoken much about things like theme or central tension, but using one of your capitals as a microcosm for one of these things can be a good way to introduce your players to it. We'll talk more about this in a later video, but the central tension of Praxis is old versus new, and we're going to let that shine through in the frigid capital of the dusk-weary forest. Tanalte is the most remote of the capital cities. Sequestered away behind miles of dense coniferous forest, it has thrived due to its religious significance. Originally settled atop some ancient ruins by a community of fire genasi, stories quickly spread of how close this city was to the gods. Now renowned throughout the continent as a place of pilgrimage, Tanalte sees a massive turnover of travelers in its summer months, despite the locals' disdain for tourists. Many of Tanalte's residents would be just fine if the pilgrimage business dried up, instead preferring the city concentrate on its production of magically infused pine resin. The issue has gotten so divisive that aspersions of corruption have been cast at the Council of Elders. All of these problems seem trivial, though, compared to the city's latest issue. A delegation of Aquians, native to the plane of water, have emerged from the ocean, demanding that the residents of Tanalte give them their city back. Located where the Karmara River breaks through the rolling boreal forests of Heldir and meets the Easter Sea, Shava's harbor has long served as the last major stop for any northbound ships. But what was originally a small depot for said ships to restock is now one of the realm's most bustling cities. Shava's harbor exists in a constant state of dichotomy. Part of the city serves the same purpose it always has: smelly loading docks, seedy bars, and houses of debauchery for any sailors looking to enjoy their short time ashore. But a new side of the city has blossomed as well, centered around the Academy. Built and maintained to glorify Filhiji the elephant, god of healing and caretaking, it has turned the notoriously rowdy town into a much homelier place than one would expect. To fund its philanthropy, the Academy sells a purifying powder made by its clerics, which has, in the last few generations, become an essential product across the continent. The Academy's unwitting entry into the global export business only increased the city's traffic, to the point of it being on par in population with the other capital cities of Praxis. The success of the powder trade was such that it reshaped how the city was governed. The old magistrate position became nothing but a figurehead, the city's true political power lying with the Academy Council. But what Shava's harbor lacked most was any sort of military power. Rather isolated in the Heldir forest, it hadn't ever needed one, until the monster sightings started. Here in the center of our continent, we've got a nice inland sea, the coast of which houses the capital of the windswept wilds. During the constant warring of the Stalith and Esbor empires, many people were displaced and in need of a new home. One which was out of the scope of the human empires, was accepting to outsiders, and which held the promise of a new life. It was no surprise that so many refugees found themselves in Edgemere. What began as a small fishing settlement quickly ballooned into a bustling trade hub, bolstered by its control of the region's tin exports as well as world-renowned craftsmen. Edgemere is now the continent's most populous city. Its roots as a coalition of displaced cultures still influence it today. Its government functions as a confederacy of microstates, which has given the city a well-earned reputation of cutthroat politics. Most of the time, the politicking stays out of the public eye, but now and then it bleeds into the forefront. And with one of the city's most influential magistrates on their deathbed, another chapter of political drama in Edgemere looks to be right around the corner. Far across the Easter Sea lie the Evening Isles. Founded in a small cove, Waldreth was intended to be naturally defensible against the many pelagic dangers of the region. But it's been many generations since the last Leviathan sighting. Waldreth has since settled into a comfortable position as a maritime trade hub. Though its economy is driven by the aforementioned trade, as well as a nearby gold mine, many travelers have another reason for visiting: the port city's world-famous cuisine. Any true lover of seafood with the means to travel includes a trip to Waldreth on their bucket list. But the city's normal tenor of frivolity has recently taken a turn towards a graver tone. The arrival of a mysterious newcomer has stirred up concerned whispers. No one knows their identity, only that they brought incredible wealth with them. What's more, the city's mages have detected a devastatingly powerful magical aura surrounding the stranger. To add to the council's growing concerns, one of their most trusted augurs has foretold an imminent disaster, its point of impact worryingly close to the cove which Waldreth calls home. In the foothills of the Esbor Mountains, Seiban bridges the gap between the alpine and the temperate. Originally a quiet elven community, in the Third Age it became a stopover town in the Esbor Empire's trade network. When the aforementioned fell, Seiban cloistered itself as a means of preservation, letting several generations pass before opening its gates to the outside world again. But the world it let in was not the one it remembered. What was once a politically complex continent dominated by two superpowers was now a lawless expanse, whose capitals hardly functioned as such. But Seiban, in its centuries of isolation, had not forgotten how to rule. Presided over by the frigid Mistraleth dynasty, the elven city saw before it a naive continent, ripe for the taking. But as often go the best laid plans, the city's campaign of expansion would have to wait. The Mistraleth clan signet ring, symbol of their rule and powerful magical item in its own right, has gone missing. At least that's the official story. What the public doesn't know is that the ring was stolen during a particularly elaborate heist, a mystery the city's monarch very much wants solved. While searching for an adventuring party which is both adept and subtle enough to investigate further, Seiban's plans of conquest are in a holding pattern, as it slowly works its way into the good graces of the continent by way of its outgoing carnelian trade and the pull of its opulent gambling halls. Finally, we're going to add our continent's largest rivers. This might seem a bit out of order, but I like to place my rivers around the same time I'm designing my setting's largest cities. That way I can place the city based on its history and then just run a river through it. Because, unless you're solving the whole people need water to live problem with magic or weirdness, almost every large city is going to be close to a river or a lake. As far as actually drawing your rivers goes, the general rule is start with an area of high rainfall or melting glaciers and let gravity do the rest. Small rivers will coalesce into larger ones as they go downhill. If they don't have anywhere more downhill to go to, they will form a lake. Otherwise, they will terminate in an ocean. Keeping all of that in mind, we'll run some rivers through our capitals, as well as our setting's ancient cities. The elevations we drew a few steps ago should come in handy during this step. As much fun as it is to build the individual parts of our setting, like its capital cities for instance, it is just as important to connect them to each other. So we're going to take our capital cities and let them interact with each other, using the connections between them to weave one large political tapestry. Since our setting is a politically devolved one, we aren't going to be designing any complex treaties or feudal structures, but these are sizable, successful sovereignties, which are all aware of each other. So we are going to make a little organizer here and think about what kind of relationship each capital city might have with its closest neighbors, while keeping the respective goals of each in mind as we do so. Remember, nothing is canon until it has been seen by an audience. So if any of your ideas about how these cities might interact with each other conflict with the things you've already built, feel free to amend them as needed. Since Trefton is the nearest capital to where our first few adventures are going to take place, let's start there. An epidemic of magically induced illnesses is going to send some ripples through our setting. First and foremost, Trefton's imports of purifying powder from Shava's harbor have reached an all-time high, as healers desperately tried to keep up with the city's failing health. Next, every good conspiracy needs a paper trail, or at least something incriminating for the heroes to find. Perhaps Seiban sent a peace offering of disease detection amulets northward, and perhaps the Trefton aristocracy, aware of what the amulets would detect, stashed them in a warehouse. Moving southward to the Evening Isles, what about that powerful newcomer to Waldreth? Maybe a high-ranking magic user in Seiban got wind of the Trefton cover-up and was appalled. The Mistraleth dynasty, however, had no interest in blowing any whistles, much more concerned with their diplomatic relations than a few sick peasants. So maybe said magic user was forced to defect to the south, bringing a complicated political situation to Waldreth's idyllic doorstep. Out in the rainforest, Archelia's technological revolution has not gone unnoticed. The city's new, idealist leanings have brought it more in line with the liberty-focused members of the Waldreth Council of Elders. This evolution, along with Archelia's newly developed maritime technology, has caused the effective distance between the two capitals to shrink significantly. Optimists in both cities see allyship in the future, while the less hopeful among them are preparing for war. To the north, in the windswept wilds, the rulers of Edgemere are growing restless. It has long had the most powerful navy on the continent, and a unification of Waldreth and Archelia threatens to change that. This fear, along with its precarious political situation, has led Edgemere to reach out to Seiban, where tentative talks of a defensive treaty have started. Meanwhile, in the wake of the southern half of the continent gearing up for a political evolution, the people of Herhadrom are afraid of another descent into imperialism, hearing little but the echoes of the still-feared Hevingvat Empire. But, of course, they have their own problems. With the threat of old beasties waking from their slumber, the Herhadrom Parliament is desperately searching for answers. This has led them to reach out to the Trefton High Court in hopes of accessing the city's ancient libraries, a request which has unwittingly brought the mountain stronghold into a continent-wide political powder keg. Among the frigid lakes of the Duskweary Forest, Tanalte is largely agnostic to the political dalliances of the more southern capitals, as an existential threat in the form of Aqueans from the Plane of Water have all but demanded control of their city. In the wake of this development, Herhadrom guaranteed military help for Tanalte to retain its independence. But that was before the dwarven city's recent troubles began. Along the northern coast in the Heldir Forest, the drums of war can be heard in Shava's harbor. A military had never been part of the plan, especially in a city controlled by an order of peace-loving clerics. But it was now unavoidable. What started with isolated sightings of otherworldly creatures recently became verifiable reports of a massive horde of aberrant monsters radiating from somewhere in the Karmara hinterlands. A panicked populace has done everything it can to prepare for a counteroffensive, but those precious few with combat experience do not have high hopes. To fund the defensive effort, Shava's harbor has leaned even more heavily on their exports of purifying powder. Some residents believe it should be stockpiled for the fight to come, but the Trefton guilds pay very, very well, which has brought us full circle. A complicated web of diplomacy and political tension can give our setting a steady drip of drama. And if our players choose to interact with it, it can give them the opportunity to leave an indelible mark on the world around their characters. Well, that was fun. After the craziness of the last video, it was nice to get back to world building. Next time, we'll zoom into the Galeniod region and map it in more detail, getting to know the area our players will be adventuring in. Thanks for watching, everybody. If you want to support me, you can do all the normal stuff down here at the bottom, or you can head over to the Patreon, where you can see the videos early for $1, or get your name into the credits for $5. See ya. Going forward, we're going to be making the same rules for our other capital cities, while going into less detail. Why can't I say this like a human being? Who wrote this? I want to talk to the writer. When building your capital cities, keep this in mind. What if I just don't do any of this? What if I just don't mention this at all? We're gonna not do that. I'm striking through all this. You're cooked. But these are sizable, successful... Why did I write it like this?